Welcome to the 3BA podcast, where bourbon, boners, and being awesome isn't just a catchy tagline, but actual categories in which we discuss different topics every single day. My name's Garrett, and I'll be your host along this unique journey through the bourbon and whiskey craze, men's health, and all the crazy things that life throws at you in between. On today's bourbon review, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I know it's only the second bourbon review, but on this particular review, I'm going to review a blended whiskey. I know, oh my gosh, it's not just bourbon, but it contains bourbon. And quite frankly, it's a very unique flavor profile, which I'm going to allude to, but I'm not going to give you tasting notes. But most of all, I want to tell you about it because it's won so many awards, and quite frankly, it's delicious. That's about as much as you're going to get out of me. On today's episode, we are going to be reviewing none other than Barrell Seagrass. It won a lot of awards. Most recently in 2021, it won the World Spirits Competition, won double gold. I think they give that to everybody. I'm not knocking that competition if you follow me eventually. But it won double gold. It caught the attention of a lot of very important bourbon connoisseurs and bourbon, I guess, aficionados would be a better way to put it. And with that, it caught the attention of some very famous bourbon drinkers, which you may or may not know. And then they recommended it to the world. And lo and behold, here we are doing a bourbon review about it. Why am I particularly fond of this? I like it because it is different. You're going to hear that on a lot of my bourbon reviews. What makes it unique? What makes it different? Why pick this over another bottle that you can spend your well-earned money on? We're going to hope to touch on a little bit of that today. And additionally, we're going to give you some of my findings, how I feel about it, once again, would I buy it again, and would I buy it on the secondary. Those are the three big key factors in my particular bourbon review. And I'm going to tell you a little story about it specifically for me. So to start off, this is a blended bourbon whiskey. So it's a blend. What does that mean for those people who are a little newer to this particular genre? Well, blended means it doesn't just take bourbon. It takes a bunch of different aspects, maybe rebarrels it, maybe mixes in a couple unique flavors, maybe takes some rum or some brandy and mixes it all together, blends it, as you will, to make a final product that seemingly tastes very unique. What do I mean by unique? It claims to come through with an apricot brandy finish. And I think it's finished in apricot brandy barrels. It is. And they're sourced from different parts of the world. What does that mean for you? Well, if you ever get a chance to try it, you can read the back of the bottle. I'm not going to bore you with those details. But essentially what it blends, and this is the important part, is bourbon, some whiskey from Tennessee, some whiskey from Canada, and some whiskey from Indiana. Now, we all know what I'm talking about when I talk about Indiana. We're talking about MGP. Okay, we're just going to rip that Band-Aid off right off the bat. MGP juice. They have some MGP in here. Again, these are all sourced from different places. There's no particular set bourbon that they add in this. I think if you go on their website or you do some research, you're more than welcome to probably find out or do some digging to see where they source their particular bourbon from. But they reside in Louisville, Kentucky. So Barrell was started all the way back in 2012, believe it or not. 10-year anniversary is this year. They didn't really come out with their first product until 2014. They did do a blend in 2014. And that was when they released their first bottle of Barrell. It had a special name. I think it was Barrell Gold or Barrell Gold number 1. That's the research that I did about Barrell's history. And why it's just so abbreviated is it's a relatively new distillery with a newer concept. What do I mean by newer concept? Well, I'm going to go back to saying what you've heard 4 times now. It's blended. A lot of purists in the bourbon community would tell you that blended whiskey or blended bourbon isn't real bourbon. You dilute the fact that it's pure bourbon by adding in Tennessee whiskey, Canadian whiskey, whiskey from Indiana that's not barreled, aged, and matured in Kentucky. distilled. That's a full definition of distilled. That being the case, it was always for me something that I didn't necessarily want to try. I'll admit it. I was a little snobby right off the bat when I first heard about Barrell. There was nothing about it that enticed me. I saw these funky looking bottles that were just odd shaped to me, to the eye, wasn't aesthetically pleasing. It just looked like a weird, not rigid bottle like I'm used to, or the round, cylindrical, tall, skinny bottle like most other bottles in the bourbon community. What does that mean? Nothing. It really doesn't mean anything. I'm biased purely because it's a blended whiskey. That's how it started for me. Some of you may know this. Some of you may follow this gentleman. Eventually, I would love to talk to him. I'd love to get his take on some things. I got a chance to see him speak once. But Fred Minnick, whose name I'll probably bring up many other times throughout this podcast, put his stamp of approval on this particular spirit, and that is the Seagrass variety. Once that happened, a lot of you may or may not know this, but when that happens, the spirit just takes off. Initially, last year, when I first was introduced to, I think it was batch 2 of the Seagrass, you could barely find it. It was flying off of shelves. The price point was $69.99 at the time. There's a reason why I say at the time. And you couldn't get it. I had to drive to Kentucky with a friend. On other podcasts, you may recognize him. His name is Nick, who actually ended up telling me about it. Wasn't on my radar at all. I thought it's another odd-shaped new artesian bourbon that's there. They're mixing a bunch of spirits. It's not really my jam. It's not really my game. Give me the traditional. Let's go find some cool bottles, in the state below mine where, again, we're located in Ohio. Let's drive down to Kentucky. Let's find something. It might as well be its own different country, but let's find something unique. His recommendation was this. And the story that I have about it goes a little like this. When we get to Kentucky, and a couple of the honey holes, we'll talk about that on another podcast, he walks up and he says to me, here's my list. Here's what I have collected from friends that they want me to pick up for them. They call that a muling opportunity, where you mule spirits back for your friends. He goes, I've been asked by multiple people to grab this Barrell Seagrass. I looked at him and I said, man, go ahead. I don't know what that is. Barrel's not my jam. It's not. I don't even. They mix stuff together. Why did you want to try it? He goes, well, Fred Minnick said that this Seagrass tasted amazing. They had a great blend. It was a great mixture. I think we should try it. Again, very nonchalantly kind of blew him off and just said, okay, whatever, go ahead. If you can find some, grab it. Grab it for your friends. You're the one muling them back, not me. He said, all right, well, we'll look. We found it at the first store. They had 2 bottles left. He bought both. Another honey hole or store that we visit quite often, we went into there. They had 2 bottles again. Grabbed both of them. It wasn't until probably 4 stores or stops later that we found roughly 4 to 6, so a case. He looked at me, texted some of his friends, as he did, wanted them all. So in all, his count was anywhere between 8 to 10 bottles of this Seagrass, which he bought at, I told you, roughly $69.99. He did tell me, he said, Garrett, I think we should buy a bottle together and try it. Me being very open to trying new things, but maybe not investing in new things until they're proven, or I get to try to taste it at a bar or somewhere else, somebody else's house, which I've talked about before. $69.99 was below my budget, but it was just, again, out of my realm of even consideration. And that's unfortunate. And I'll tell you why. We brought one of these bottles back for both of us to try. And after our trip, the same night, we actually missed some dinner plans that night, but that same night, we got back and he said, let's crack it open. Let's just give it a try. Well, I'm here to tell you that night, I don't know when the specific date was or the particular season. I can tell you it was last year. That particular night, we got back, we cracked open a bottle, poured 2 glasses, and sat down and we said, okay, let's give it a shot. Well, I can admit when I am wrong, and you're going to hear it here today. I was absolutely wrong. This is one of the most, as I said before, delicious and unique flavor profiles I personally have ever tasted in a bourbon. Again, blended, but bourbon nonetheless. It contains bourbon. I won't call it complete bourbon, but I will tell you that Barrell Seagrass is an amazing pour if you're looking for something different. Now, you may not like it. That's your palate. You may not ever want to spend the money to get one. That's your prerogative. For me, I will absolutely grab a bottle of this whenever I'm traveling, whenever I'm around Kentucky, in and around Kentucky, or now I think they're releasing it in Ohio if I can find it. But I can tell you that even now in Ohio, after it's been released in multiple states, it's flying off the shelves, specifically the Seagrass variety. Now, I told you I don't like to give specific tasting notes. I'm not going to. You can read what's in it. But I am going to tell you the proof, and there's a reason for this. The proof on this is 119.3. If you're doing quick math, 59.65% alcohol. What you're going to find out about me on these podcasts when I do the bourbon reviews, I'm going to tell you anything over 50% for me just hits my mouth with a little heat. What is heat? Well, that's the burn, the sensation you get when you put it into your mouth, swish it around, and you get your taste buds warmed up. A further story about how I like to drink bourbon and how I was taught to drink bourbon. So tonight, this is the first glass of bourbon I poured. Before I start to get the full flavor experience, you almost have to warm up your mouth. Again, probably not the best expression, but that's what I'm going to say today. You need to warm up your mouth. You need to warm up your taste buds, or you need to burn your taste buds. That's what I say. So a lot of people who I've drank some bourbon with in the past who said, man, Garrett, I really don't like bourbon. It burns my mouth. It burns my chest. It just doesn't taste good. I'm not a big bourbon fan. I'm not a big whiskey fan. And I always tell them the same thing, which I'm going to tell you now. If you ever sit down and want to do a tasting with me, I will get you, I will find you, I will progress your taste buds in a direction that you didn't think was possible. I'm that confident. And at the end of it, if you don't like what I have for you to try, then quite frankly, I think your taste buds are way off.
So with no further ado, I'm going to start warming up my taste buds, telling you how I was taught to drink bourbon. I think this episode's a great one to just dive right into it. And I'll tell you the story, where I learned it from. I stole this from somebody. Well, steal is a strong word. I was taught this from somebody. So initially, first glass of the night, small sip just to coat your mouth. Now I'm going to swish into the microphone. Sorry for those listening out there. Count to 5.
It's going to burn your mouth. I'm salivating a little bit. Burn my mouth. It's a higher proof. 56. What did I say? 56. 59. I apologize. 59.65. Oh, boy. Sorry. Making my mouth water. What I like to do, I didn't nose it. Some people nose it. I guess I should have told you maybe to do that. I like to smell it if I've never tried it before. A trick with nosing, by the way, very quickly, I'm a little off topic and out of order, but if you're going to nose a bourbon, by all means, give it a whiff. The best way to do that, for those of you who don't know, you don't just stick your nose deep in it. Stick your nose above it. Let it get out of the glass. If you're using a whiskey glass, if you're using a rocks glass, whatever you want to do, whatever glass you're using, keep your nose above the edge of the glass, like so. And open your mouth ever so slightly. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. You're saying, Garrett, oh, come on, that's pretty typical. That's original. Well, most people just stick their nose in and breathe in. Keep their mouth closed. If you open your mouth, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, it gets down into the back of your nasal cavity. This is a true story. It gets in the back of your nasal cavity, which is the upper part of your esophagus and in your throat. So that's where your air intake goes. That's how you breathe. So you're going to inhale that, and you're going to get it further into your system than you would if you were just breathing in through your nose, because you're breathing out through your mouth. It's kind of rotating through your breathing cycle, if you will. I'm sure there's more scientific ways to put that, but that's what I was always taught. I truly do believe. Give it a try sometime. If you breathe just through your nose, you get a little bit different, but if you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, you get a little bit more of that sensation, that smell, those notes, if you will. So back to what I was telling you about learning to drink bourbon. Initially, I wasn't great. I just poured it in a glass, tried to take it, fought off the taste of the burn, the initial burn, and I didn't really enjoy it to begin with, especially on a night just like the one drink you saw me take. I mean, it made my mouth water. Still is. I visited my very first distillery. This is a story for another time, but I'm going to tell you what it was now, and I'll tell you a little bit about my first experience. But it was Woodford Reserve. It's in Versailles, Kentucky. And when I went to Woodford, I didn't know much about bourbon. It was my very first time ever visiting a distillery. Still one of my favorites to this day. But I got through the tour. I did all the touristy things. And when we got to the tasting, it was a different time than many years ago, almost 8 years ago. I sat down. There was an older gentleman there, and I'm sorry I don't know his name, and I would give him all the credit in the world right now if I could. But he was doing the tasting at the time. We'll call it a random Thursday, because it really was. It was a weekday. It wasn't a weekend when they had more tourists like me. It was a weekday. And when I went in to do my tour, we did it. Got in to do the tasting, and before we just dove in, and again, I'm going to tell you it was a little bit of a different time, he said, here's what I want you to do. How many first-time bourbon drinkers in here? And I raised my hand, a couple of us did, and he said, okay, so here's what I'm going to tell you to do. The first one's going to burn. You just saw me take it. You saw me swish it around and do it. He said exactly that. He said, take it in your mouth enough to coat your mouth, swish it around. It's going to burn. Let it burn. After you've swished it and the burn coats your mouth, go ahead and give it a swallow. 5 to 10 seconds of swishing. When you're done, there's this breathing out through your mouth again. Breathe out through your mouth. It's going to light up your mouth. What I say by heat, that means it's going to burn is a generic term, but it's going to light up your taste buds and the different sensations in your mouth. Almost a numbing effect. Some will salivate on higher proof bourbons, as I'm doing right now. But he said after that first initial burn, your mouth's going to be coated. He goes, once we do that, and everybody did it, he said, take it and swish. He goes, let's go on to number 2. So you take small sip number 2. Swish that one around as well. I did it for about 5 seconds. It's going to burn, but it's going to burn a lot less. Again, it does. Still has a little bit of a burn for me. You're getting more flavor, exactly his words. But it's going to burn a lot less. And when you breathe out of your mouth, as I just did, the sensation in your mouth is going to get stronger, meaning you're going to get more flavor. You're going to decipher that on your own, but you're going to get more flavor now that you've opened up your senses, opened up the taste buds, opened up the areas in your mouth that maybe were not awakened throughout the day. He said, now comes the fun part. Now comes the money sip. And the money sip is going to be number 3. Now, granted, this was Woodford. The gentleman was kind of talking to us throughout the entire time, telling us the history of Woodford. And obviously, in this particular episode, we're not tasting Woodford. We're tasting Barrell Seagrass. But the same principles still stand true. So I've taken 2 sips, and now on this very third one, this very unique sip, if you will, to his credit, and now to this day, I truly believe that on this third sip, you get the full body of flavor, the full tasting, if you will, of whatever bourbon that you're drinking for that evening. You get that full caveat of profile, explanation, flavor blending in this scenario that they've described before you got there, before you even looked at the bourbon that you were drinking. So somebody way more experienced than me with a way better palate came up with these flavors and these notes. What they hope, when I say they, what bourbon distillers hope is that you get that profile, or you get a hint of that profile, at least some part of it, because That's what they want you to enjoy, want you to feel, want you to taste. So here we are, sip number 3. No further ado. No swishing. Sip, swallow. I'm smiling for those who can't see. It's fantastic. It is so drastically different than your standard bourbon pour that I recommend it to everyone who's looking to try something new. If they can afford it, because I also wanted to talk about that, the price has changed. They call it the Minnick effect in some areas. When a bourbon gets announced, it flies off the shelf, and unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately, some distillers, especially these craft distillers, may or may not try to take advantage of that notoriety. I don't believe it was done in malice. I think it was done in the opportunity that they were given. But it went from $69.99 up to $89.99. That is the MSRP price of Barrell Seagrass in my area of the country. On a different episode, we'll talk about regulated states versus unregulated states, but the recommended MSRP price is $89.99. Most areas of Kentucky, you can find it for that price. All over Ohio, you can find it for that price when it's available. I will absolutely, positively, without hesitation in my voice, tell you that whenever I get the chance, I will purchase a bottle of Barrell Seagrass, especially if I have one open and I don't have a reserve. I always make sure I get a reserve. Minor note, side note, if you will, on that particular topic of buying bottles. Rule of thumb, if you're into bourbon at all, or if you've been in bourbon in the past and you're expanding your bourbon knowledge and your bourbon expertise, always buy 2. It's the rule of 2. Drink 1, keep 1. Is that always going to be available to you? No. Is that always going to be hard to find with your allocated? Absolutely. Is it sometimes not illegal, but is it sometimes not available to you to buy 2 when you get to wherever you are? Absolutely. Is sometimes the price gouging that happens in other states prohibit you from buying those bottles, 1 or 2? Absolutely it does. If you're able to, if you have the means to, always try to buy 2, especially if you've had it before and you enjoy it, so you always have a backup. Probably an obvious statement, but I make sure that especially for anyone who's new into bourbon or who's seeing a bottle that they may want to try it sometime, to let them know what I would do in their situation. So I answered the second question. I think you already know what I alluded to in the first question. Would I drink it again? Absolutely. You can see that I have multiple bottles. That night a year ago when we tried it, it was so good that I have since purchased many, many bottles since. The price point is where I think it should be. And then the last question, would I buy it again on the secondary? As my last tasting went, there's no real secondary market for it at the moment. Hopefully it stays that way. Initially there was. For those of you who maybe were trying to get a bottle and then resell it to somebody who didn't have a chance to get a bottle, there was a slight markup a year ago when the first 2 or 3 batches came out. We're well beyond those original batches, and we're now into the later regulated releases. What do I mean by regulated? They've tried to keep the flavor profile almost identical, batch over batch. They've mixed. They found a great recipe for their blended whiskey. So not much of a secondary price. If they went to the secondary and I couldn't find it, I would absolutely buy another bottle. This is a flavor profile that is not your standard bourbon pour. If you get a chance to try it out at a bar or a restaurant and you've never had it before, I highly recommend doing it. Have a couple. I know that's going to sound strange, but if you have something that you like, let's say a Buffalo Trace or a Woodford that we talked about earlier, and you've been drinking that, neat, rocks, however you like it, try this after. It's very very different. I love different. You're going to find out on my tastings, I look for different. Is different good? Most times I believe that it is. Is different always good? No. I have stories on stories and maybe a bottle or two that I'll show you that different isn't necessarily good, but it is different. That is absolutely sure. To finally just kind of sum this up, Barrell is a newer product. I say newer. You heard me say they started in 2012. The Seagrass, I don't remember when the first one came out. I'm just going to tell you when they won their gold. It's got this nifty little metal tag. It's not metal, but a tag that shows when they won their medals. Barrell won all the awards in 2021. Barrell Seagrass, I apologize, won the awards in 2021. Highly recommend it. Sorry that I'm repeating myself. Definitely drink it again. Definitely would buy it again. Definitely would invest in it on the secondary market. Totally worth the price to me. And that recommendation for you would be the same as it was in the previous tastings. And that is, if you get a chance, try it or come to your friend's house, log in. Like I said, we're going to be giving away samples of these bottles eventually. So once we start to get these episodes out and we start getting some lives and we start getting some followings, throughout the week after our Monday bourbon review, we'll probably send out a full bottle of samples, 1 to 2 ounce samples, depending upon how generous we're feeling or how we're going to pour them into the sample bottles. And we'll get those out to people and for you to try at home. And we'd love to hear your reactions, get your feedback as well. I, again, highly recommend this blend. It's the first review about a blend. And then to tell you a little bit, maybe a down the road, a special episode of a bourbon tasting, there is a Barrell Seagrass barrel strength variety. Quite a bit more expensive, but I want to hint at a possible future tasting episode where we get a bottle of the Barrell Seagrass barrel proof and taste that for you as well. Never tried it, never had it, but I would love to experiment with it since this is so good to me. So one last time, Barrell Seagrass, check it out. I get nothing for promoting them, but just to tell you, on a night like tonight, and a day like the day that I have had today, this particular pour is a great one to sit down and enjoy, a little bit higher proof, and sit down, sip on something that's very different than your regular everyday Kentucky bourbon. It's a blend. Again, take that the way you would like. And finally, cheers to you. Thanks for hanging out with us for the second bourbon review. I know we got right into a blend on the second review, but I think it was worth it. For those of you out there enjoying this spirit tonight, cheers to you. And for those who are going to try it in the future, enjoy. Have a good night.